My name's Jess. I am 30 years old. I'm a mum of 2 and I was diagnosed with MS in 2018. So when you're diagnosed with MS, you lose control of your body, you lose control of your future. So it's so important to have somebody with you to help you through that fight. The MS Society gave me comfort, reassurance, a safe space. They helped me to understand that my life wasn't over just because I had MS. They've been with me every step of the way. Fundraising is so important. If I was to wake up tomorrow and hear that there was a cure for multiple sclerosis, it would absolutely change my world. I do have multiple sclerosis, but I won't let it have me.
Excellent. Well, I'd like to welcome you all here to this very special research update. It's been put on behalf of Multiple Sclerosis Society of South Australia and Northern Territory in conjunction with MS Australia. We've entitled it The Pursuit of a Cure, and it's really a celebration of 50 years of progress for MS Australia. I'm Dr. Hamish Campbell. I'm the Deputy Head of Research at MS Australia, and I'll be the MC for today. First of all, we're just going to have some brief housekeeping announcements. Toilets are back out here through the door and round the corner. In the case of an emergency, we'll ask you to leave via the exits and gather on the lawn behind this theatre. Can I also ask people if they can turn their phones off or put them on silent so we don't have any disruptions. The event is also live streamed, so I'd like to welcome our online audience, and I'm sure we're going to have some very interesting discussions today. I'll leave some of the introductions to the chair of MS South Australia and Northern Territories, but what I'll do is roughly run through the plan which we have. So we're going to have a few formalities at the start, then I'm going to briefly talk about MS, and then we have some of our experts from South Australia talk to us, Dr. Lesley-Ann, a consultant neurologist, and Dr. Iain Comerford, an MS Australia Senior Research Fellow, and Dr. Julia Morahan, our Head of Research. And then after that, once our experts have spoken to us, we'll have a quick Q&A session. We've had some pre-submitted questions. They are excellent. I think the panel will find them very challenging, but I'm sure they'll be able to handle them. But first, we are very delighted to have Her Excellency the Honourable Frances Adamson, the Governor of South Australia, and her husband, Mr. Rod Bunton, who are here to join us for this research update. Both Her Excellency and Mr. Bunton are patrons of MS Society of South Australia and Northern Territory, and if you're able, can I ask you to please be upstanding for Her Excellency and Mr. Bunton to enter the hall, accompanied by Kerry Sanders, the Chair of MS Society South Australia and Northern Territory. Welcome. Thank you. Please take your seats. Can I now call on Uncle Rod O'Brien, the Cultural Advisor at the University of Adelaide, to perform a Welcome to Country.
Thank you, Hamish. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to give the welcome. Language is a passion of mine, and especially Ghana language. Our language was considered an endangered language, and we were fortunate enough that two German missionaries, Tychem and Sherman, recorded 3,000 of our words back in the 1830s, and they actually taught our children, Ghana children, in Ghana language for 6 years on the River Torrens, from 1839 to 1845. But through that process, our language was lost after that teaching stopped, and we were fortunate enough to start reviving it in 1989. And so now our vision is that one day the language is spoken on all the schools on the Adelaide Plains. And I say that not just to Ghana kids or Aboriginal kids, but to all kids, because we believe the language doesn't only belong to Ghana people, it belongs to the country. And so if we say, our old people said, if you know our language, you'll know our country better. If you know our country better, you'll live a better life because you'll care for the country more. And then if you care for our country, the country will care for you. But anyway, my job is to give the welcome. So I'll get on with it, but I'll just like to say MS is a pretty sort of special thing. Not special to me, but one of my friends had MS, or she still has, and so I'm very interested to see how we can cure this thing, because it's very disabilitating to people's lives. Anyway, I'll get on with the welcome. Machawanga Ghana Mena, no Wangari. Mani Nabudni, Gani Atana, Niboko Mankalankala, Tandanya Meanaku, Nachi Yungandaya, Nachi Yakandaya, Padni Adu Wadu. So on behalf of the Ghana people, I welcome you to Ghana country. I do this ambassador of the Adelaide Plains people. My brothers, my sisters, let's walk together in harmony. Natalia, thank you and have a good day.
And now if I can call on Kerry Stalker, the President and Chair of the MS Society of South Australia and Northern Territory. Sorry, Kerry Sanders.
Thank you. Thank you, Uncle Rod, for joining us here today and for welcoming us all to Ghanaland. On behalf of the MS Society, SA and NT, I would like to thank our patrons, Her Excellency, the Honourable Frances Adamson, Governor of South Australia, and her husband, Mr. Rod Bunton, for joining us here today. It's an honour to have you attend our research briefing and marking 50 years of MS Australia and celebrating the relationship between the MS Society of South Australia and Northern Territory and MS Australia. We are incredibly grateful to have your support as patrons of the MS Society, SA and NT. I'd also like to acknowledge other VIPs joining us here today. Representing MS Australia is Mr. Ron Greenland, CEO of MS Australia. And of course, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues from the MS Society SA and NT, Interim CEO Emma Hinchy, our recently announced and soon-to-be CEO Janine Jackson, and my fellow members of the MS Society SA and NT board. Equally important, I'd like to acknowledge long-time friends and supporters of the MS Society and anyone joining us today who lives with multiple sclerosis and their families and friends and supporters. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us here today, physically at the University of Adelaide, and to all of you who are joining us online, we thank you. And on behalf of the MS Society, SA and NT and MS Australia, I would like to thank you and welcome you to this special MS research briefing in pursuit of a cure. The event was brought about to mark the 50th anniversary of MS Australia. I'm sure many of you will be aware of MS Australia. They are our country's national multiple sclerosis not-for-profit organisation focusing on research and advocacy. They coordinate the national research funding efforts and the message around the issues of magnitude for people living with MS. MS Australia has recently released an advocacy campaign called A Better NDIS for people living with MS, an important national push for improvements to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. That campaign has been gaining good traction in recent months. MS Australia also coordinates national MS research funding and Australia's representation in international MS research efforts. This is the topic that has brought us all together this afternoon, and you'll learn more about this today. While MS Australia performs the research coordination and advocacy functions, the state and territory organisations like us at SANNT work at the community level. We provide essential service and support to people living with MS, and this is done through a variety of channels. Our health and wellbeing programs and educational sessions for the newly diagnosed and for those who are continuing to learn how to best manage their MS. We offer our community regular therapy sessions with MS nurses, helping to navigate often complex medical diagnosis and comorbidities, alongside occupational therapy, physiotherapy, and exercise classes. We run educational sessions for healthcare professionals throughout South Australia and the Northern Territory, so they better understand how to treat and support their patients with MS. We also, of course, will work to bring our community together to ensure they feel supported in other ways through support networks and family and community events. We also drive local fundraising through activities like our MS Mighty Swim, our community appeals, the local efforts with national campaigns like MS Readathon and the May 50K. The money that we raise through these campaigns supports our community activities, and a portion of this also goes to MS Australia to ensure they can maintain research funding for their national campaigning and advocacy activities. I'm sure you therefore understand the importance of the partnership between MS Australia and the state and territory organisations, and why we at the MS Society, SANNT, wanted to collaborate with MS Australia here today to celebrate 50 years of MS Australia and the important role that they have played and will continue to play for the community of the people we serve. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Hamish Campbell to return to the microphone. Hamish is the Deputy Head of Research at MS Australia, and today he's going to provide the context for today's research briefing. He'll delve into explaining what MS is and provide an overview of the condition and its current treatments. Please welcome Hamish.
Excellent. I've been given the task of kind of giving a bit of background, and I know for some of you it's probably old information, but it's very important that we kind of get the basis right for some of the more complicated talks from some of the experts that are coming on. So as Kerry's mentioned, we're from MS Australia, and we're the peak body made up of our various member organisations, and we were amalgamated or consolidated between MS Research Australia and MS Australia back in 2020, and what it really did is it meant there was one voice in Australia for research, one voice in Australia for advocacy, and one voice for education and awareness. And it is now our 50th anniversary, so it's our birthday, and hence an excuse to come out and have a research roadshow. So over those years, we have invested over $54 million in MS research. We have funded over 900 clinicians and MS researchers around Australia, and we've awarded over 360 research grants in Australia looking at MS. Now, MS is actually the most commonly acquired neurological condition of young people. We did a study back in 2017 and came up with a number that there's over 25,600 people living with MS in Australia. And actually, I'll come back to that number a bit later. The average age of diagnosis is between 30 and 40, and 3 out of every 4 people diagnosed with MS in Australia will be women. But we've got a huge amount of momentum. We've invested a lot, but we actually have achieved a lot. And it's happened over a very short period of time. And if we look at this timeline, and I appreciate it's probably a little bit small for everybody to see, but It was in the 1980s that MRIs were really brought into the fore, that we could actually see what was happening in the brain. And for some of us, the 1980s wasn't that long ago. Other people might disagree. But it was 1996 when we got our first medication for people with MS. And since then, of course, we've had infusion medications, we've had oral medications. And what we know is we are delaying disability milestones, we're reducing hospitalisations, we're reducing the number of relapses people with MS are having. Of course, there's still a great need for progressive MS, and a lot of these medications are for relapsing remitting, and I do believe we'll be hearing more about that later. In 2007, MS Australia sponsored the AusImmune study, which was a cohort study, and it really kind of discovered and kind of reinforced some of the risk factors, some of the environmental factors which may lead to MS. And once again, we'll be talking a bit about that later as well. So I talked about there's over 25,000 Australians living with MS. We did that study back in 2017. In 2010, there was about 21,000 people with MS. So it increased over 20% in that window. And we're redoing that study because we believe that actually we're going to see even a greater increase. So it's very important that we try and understand the causes of MS to really understand what's going on. As I mentioned, we have 16 medications now available in Australia, and these are having marked effect. And MS Australia has continued and will continue to advocate that these medications are going to be included on the PBS, so it's accessible to all people with MS. So what is MS? Now, most of you are probably very familiar with this, but this image will probably come up later in some of the presentations. MS arises when the immune system attacks the brain and spinal cord. In particular, it attacks the coating on nerve fibres, which we call myelin. And of course, these nerve fibres are a bit like a wire that transduce a signal. And the immune damage, what it can do is strip that insulation off the wire, leading to either the signal being totally blocked, or actually kind of a misfiring of the signal. And of course, our brain controls everything we do, everything we feel, and all the way we control our body is all done by the brain. And so this damage can affect pretty much any part of our body. So as I mentioned, we have an increasing level of MS in Australia and probably around the world. So what's really driving that increase? Well, how does MS arise in the first place? Well, it's probably a complex interaction between our genes and our environment. So what does that mean? Well, our risk factors are things which in themselves aren't enough to give us MS, but together they can increase the risk of developing MS. And we're seeing an increase in the disease, but it's too quick to be genetic. So it's obviously something in our environment that we need to kind of help to understand. And of course, if we understand how MS arises, we can develop better treatments and hopefully a cure. So that's all well and good, but MS Australia is part of its central principles is to include people with MS. So we have people living and affected by MS at every level of organisation. Not only that, but last year we did a research priority survey where we got over 3,000 responses and we asked the community what they thought was the most important areas of research. Not surprising, number one was finding a cure through repair and regeneration. Number two was prevention of MS. And actually some of the pre-submitted questions were really focused on the prevention of MS. And three, better treatments and management of MS. Now, interestingly enough, we carried out the survey 5 years before, and number two and number three were actually around the other way. So potentially that's probably from, actually we've got far more treatments than we have had ever before. And saying that, we still have a long way to go, but that's a perfect time for me to hand over to Dr. Lesley-Ann Hall, a consultant neurologist at the Flinders Medical Centre, who's going to really talk about the research and treatment landscape.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for asking me to take part in this. It's a pleasure to be here. For those of you who don't know me, I work down at Flinders Medical Centre alongside Professor Mark Slee and our esteemed MS nurses. I am very excited to be able to share with you what the future holds and what it looks like from an MS perspective, as a neurologist, but also for people who are experiencing it. And as Hamish is saying, really the road is a very long one, but we have come so far. In the last 30 to 40 years, when you look at where we were back then, in the 1980s, we didn't have MRIs to be able to diagnose this. If we were able to diagnose it, all we had to do were give people steroids and send them off and say, this is going to happen again. And disability just continued to accumulate. And then the early treatments came along, and they suddenly started to shift the focus. And what we started to do was build on our knowledge of the immune system, so basic understanding of what the immune system does, what goes wrong in MS, the processes which affect the central nervous system, the neurobiology behind it. We know that we were able to make the diagnosis faster, but also that we are constantly improving upon how we diagnose MS and our diagnostic criteria. We now have the options for disease-modifying therapies, of which there are many, and we are continuously building on the capacity to be able to provide these sooner to patients, but also to provide more effective therapies to them. And really, we can't underestimate the importance of what the internet has done with regards to providing community supports and awareness and the capacity to be able to collaborate with people around the world at the touch of a button, which was never possible 20, 30 years or so ago. So with our focus of research, what we try and do is build on the basic concepts. So starting again with the basic immunology, the basic science, and then translate that into clinical practice. So that, the first step, as we clearly have said, we've been able to build on developing disease-modifying therapies that are very good at focusing on minimizing the risk of acute focal inflammation or relapses. From there, what we hope to do in the future is build on this and look at not just reducing the risk of having a relapse, but also how can we repair and recover the damage that is made because of those relapses and those acute episodes of inflammation. And of course, then building on that, aiming for the all-elusive top of the pyramid, the cure for MS, which certainly I think has a Nobel Prize written on with somebody's name on it when they come up with it. So what have we done well? The fact is, if you look at the last 30 years, there's been an explosion of therapies that have become available, particularly in the last 10 years, really. And these have been proven to be very, very effective and with increasing effectiveness over the past 20, 30 years. The reassuring thing is there's actually more on the horizon. So ponesimod and ublituximab are two of the newer treatments which we are hoping should be entering the Australian landscape of therapies and potentially PBS reimbursement in the next few years. Okay, so we're really good at reducing new active inflammation. We know that we can personalize these therapies. Here in Australia, we're exceptionally lucky. We can pick and choose a treatment that is going to work for a person that they are going to tolerate. That we know that some people have really aggressive forms of MS. Some have very mild forms. And so the treatments that each person may need is going to be very different. And so we can change between one or two therapies depending on how people react and respond and tolerate. We know that what works for one person doesn't actually work for another. And that's part of the role of your neurologist, obviously working with you to try and find something that helps minimize the chance of new inflammation. However, the problem is that I can't do anything to help change the damage that has already occurred. And this is really where one of the challenges arises, is that we need to find therapies that are good at not just preventing relapses, but also then subsequently delaying and preventing the disability that comes with those, but also facilitating the repair of the lesions that have already occurred. And it's really only in the last 10 years or so, I would say, that we've really started looking at remyelinating therapies and strategies for that. You can imagine, of course, a young person who is diagnosed quite young and put on a very effective therapy. Excellent, we can change the course of their future based upon that. But what we need to be able to focus on better is how can we prevent that disability progression relating to the pre-existing damage that is there. And we know, unfortunately, up to 2 out of 3 people will experience some kind of progressive disability with this disease. So it's something that really needs to be a focus. We need to do better from that in terms of focus of research. This is just a landscape with regards to the treatments that are available at the moment that have been shown to be beneficial and are available to us here in Australia, not necessarily PBS reimbursed, for progressive disease. So obviously a huge difference in the landscape when we compare that to the relapsing forms of MS. So some of the things that I think are worth knowing about, and what do I see as the next best thing? That was the first question I asked myself, and really I think BTK inhibitors are probably the one that we're going to be seeing, not just for relapsing disease, but hopefully also for progressive disease. So there's a number of trials that are going on, and it would be really nice to see something in our arsenal for progressive disease. So BTK inhibitors, so the B cell is part of the immune system, and it's involved in driving the inflammation in MS. BTK inhibitors interrupt that pathway. And so what they do is they subsequently reduce the B cell activation and reduce the subsequent downstream inflammatory effects that it has on the immune system. And it does this without depleting your B cells, like some of the other therapies that are available, and therefore it does not cause a chronic immunosuppressive state like some of those other ones. The additional benefit, and where it's really promising, is looking at in progressive disease, this is a very small molecule. So it can get into the brain and actually target some of the inflammation that is locked behind the blood-brain barrier. And we believe that this is playing a huge role in driving some of the progressive disease that we see in non-relapsing forms of MS. So there are a number of phase 2 studies that showed some very effective results. So these are very, very effective therapies at reducing new inflammation and new lesions. They have very favorable side effect profiles. Their safety data looks really good. And they do offer a few benefits compared to some of the other treatments. So for instance, their reversibility, they have very short half-lives. They're out of your system very, very quickly. With regards to trials at the moment, there are a number that are occurring worldwide. This is just a summary of them. As you can see, it's both relapsing and progressive forms. For those of you interested, the Hercules trial, which is looking in non-relapsing secondary progressive multiple sclerosis, is currently recruiting here in Adelaide. Another really interesting area that I think warrants a huge amount of investigation is treatments in advanced MS. So the original trials for the relapsing diseases really excluded people that had advanced disease, and these are usually people who are often in wheelchairs, having lost the ability to mobilize independently, and they would be excluded from trials and also excluded from receiving PBS reimbursed therapy. Now, the problem that I have with that is that people still have arms, they still have eyes, they still have brains that function and work and allow them to interact and have a quality of life. And why should we not actually be aiming to try and preserve that function as well? Since when were legs all that mattered? So these studies, two of these looking at ocrelizumab and cladribine in the UK, are currently recruiting. We're expecting results in the next few years, looking at people who have higher EDSS scores in more advanced diseases. So that's really exciting and something that I know has been in the works for a number of years. Just another positive result as well coming out about 2 years or so ago was the phase 2 study looking at ibutolast in progressive disease. So this demonstrated a slowing of brain atrophy, which we think is partially because of the chronic inflammatory states that occur within the brain. And there was also some recent data published at ECTRIMS last week looking at the positive effect on the slowly expanding lesions in progressive disease. So something certainly to keep your eye on in the future. In addition to new drugs, though, we're also looking at working smarter, and that is using old drugs that have proven safety profiles, that are readily available, that are easy to access, and can we use them to then harness the neuroprotective and antioxidant properties? So I've listed just 2 of them, but there are many more. So simvastatin is a cholesterol-lowering medication that's used by millions worldwide. Lipoic acid being an antioxidant that is easily, readily available. And the phase 2 data for these particular studies, for these particular drugs, suggests an impact of slowing of brain atrophy. So the phase 3 studies are underway. So again, watch this space. Stem cells. It wouldn't be a talk about research in MS if I didn't at least mention this. I don't have time, unfortunately, to go into this in any great depth, but rest assured there are a lot of studies that are still going on. There was some recent case and cohort series that were published last year from the UK and Italy, but also a number of trials that are still ongoing, including here in Australia, including looking at alternative sources, so not just autologous hematopoietic stem cells, but also mesenchymal stem cells, neural stem cells. And this is going to be something that will be really interesting moving forward into the future in terms of where does it fit. So remyelinating therapies. So again, none of the treatments that we have at the moment are designed to repair the damage or promote remyelination. So what we need to do is look at these, look for something that can do that in addition to not just slowing down disability progression. The problem is there's been a number of negative trials in recent years. Some of the ones that they are looking at the moment that shows some promise include a combination of metformin, which is a diabetes medication, and clemastine, an antihistamine, as well as looking at nanocrystalline gold, particularly in optic neuropathy. So again, something that will be continuing to grow over time. But what we need to do, as I was saying, is we need to become smarter with the way that we test for these things and move away from the traditional randomized control trials that we have always done in the past, which are expensive, they take a lot of time, they take a lot of recruitment. And one of the proposed ways of doing that is by using something called an adaptive trial design. And so the Octopus trial, for instance, in the UK is a beautiful example where it's a multi-arm trial that pegs multiple different drugs against each other and against a common comparator. So you can speed up recruitment, you have the capacity to be able to change the trial as it's going on. The Octopus trial particularly is looking at things with neuroprotective remyelinating properties. So we're hoping that that will speed up some of the time that we're able to get data from some of these trials. In terms of how can everyone here get involved, so there's a number of ways. So if you attend the Flinders or the Lyell McEwen Hospital to see a neurologist, we encourage you to take part in MS BASE, which is an international registry of MS patients that's utilized in a lot of research. Tracking your journey and contributing in terms of a number of the things that Hamish, for instance, pointed out beforehand. And the bonus is you guys don't actually need to do anything to do that. It's all on me. Additionally, if you would like, everybody can sign up to join the Australian MS longitudinal study. I have brought some pamphlets here if anyone wants them. This is an online survey-based research platform which is supported through MS Australia. It's very easy to join, very easy to do. If you would alternatively like to find something that's more state-specific, you can go onto the MS Trials website, select South Australia. I believe as of this week there were 26 studies listed on there that you can go to and become involved with. So here in Adelaide, we've got a number of things, including, as I was saying, the Hercules trial in non-relapsing secondary progressive MS, but also another clinical trial looking at intravenous versus subcutaneous ocrelizumab, or Ocrevus. I would be remiss if I didn't put a plug in for a study that I'm taking part in as well. For anyone who is interested, we are recruiting for this. This is looking at why patients with MS have an increased prevalence of obstructive sleep apnea. And it's looking to understand the mechanisms of lesions within the brain and their effects on airway reflexes. So we are looking at patients who don't smoke and are not necessarily the typical kind of body habitus that someone may expect to have obstructive sleep apnea. Feel free to contact me or contact our site coordinator with regards for more details. My last slide. I'm sorry I don't have a lot of time to be able to talk about these things because some of them are really exciting. Particularly, I am going to put a plug in for vitamin D. I mean, anyone who knows me knows I am a firm believer in vitamin D, not just from an MS perspective. There are additional benefits. However, the recommendations we've always made with vitamin D have been based on observational data. And as of last week, we have now 2 studies looking at both clinically isolated syndrome and as an add-on therapy to platform treatments in MS that actually aiming for super high levels of vitamin D probably doesn't make any difference. And so they were negative results. So we need to make sure people have vitamin D, good levels in their system, but we don't actually need to be aiming for the levels that we were previously aiming for based on the observational data. So it's a great example of where research actually is changing what we do in clinical practice. Then additionally, there's a huge amount of research going into EBV, which basically is looking at, could this be the causative agent? Could this be the trigger that actually then subsequently causes MS in the first place? And the subsequent thought about the impact of immunotherapies on that will be really interesting going into the future. Additionally, at ECTRIMS, there was a lot of research presented about the extreme benefits of the MS nurses, and in all fairness, I couldn't do my job without them. So I think they are hugely important, and we cannot underestimate the impact that they have on people's journeys when they're diagnosed with MS. And I won't speak much about MRI except to say that they're super exciting. So look, thank you to everybody. I'm sorry I went over time, but thank you for having me here today. And I really look forward to what the future may hold as well.
Thank you very much, Lesley-Ann. Now, if I can call on Dr. Iain Comerford, MS Australia Senior Research Fellow at the University of Adelaide, to talk about T cells and the brain, I do believe.
Thanks, Hamish. I'd like to thank the organisers for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all today about the research that we've been doing in the lab. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, so I have recently been awarded a Senior Research Fellowship from MS Australia, and what we are trying to do is to understand the basic mechanisms that cells of the immune system have to use in order to get into the brain and the spinal cord in MS. So this is very basic research, so right at the bottom of that pyramid that Lesley-Ann introduced you to, this is fundamental basic science that we hope one day might be able to be translated into useful information that can direct new therapies that are more effective in MS. All right, so the title of my talk is Preventing Inflammatory T-Cell Migration into the Brain. I was going to start with a brief overview of what MS is, but I think that has been thoroughly covered by Hamish and Lesley-Ann, so I'll move on. Suffice to say, it is a very, very serious disease that we need better therapies for, and that's what we're all really working towards. So, we think of MS as an autoimmune disease. So, what do we mean by this? And essentially, in MS, cells of the immune system, which normally would not be found within the brain and the spinal cord, are able to get into the central nervous system. And when they're in the central nervous system, the cells of the immune system that we're really talking about here are T cells and B cells. We get production of products from the B cells called antibodies, and T cells make molecules that we call cytokines. And the action of these antibodies and cytokines is to lead to the destruction of the myelin, and this leads to the symptoms of MS. So why are T cells and B cells doing this in the context of MS? Well, and what indeed are T and B cells? Well, these are the cells of our adaptive immune system. So we need T and B cells to protect us from infection. They provide specific protection against microbes, and they can provide immune memory to make sure that we don't get reinfected with the same microbes over and over and over again. This is what they look like. They're cells that circulate in our bloodstream. So they're types of white blood cells, and they usually can be found in the blood and the lymph system, but not usually in tissues, unless tissues actually have an infection ongoing. Now, we have different types of T cells. We separate them into the CD4 T cells and the CD8 T cells. CD4 T cells are what we call helper T cells. That means they help other cells in the immune system to do whatever they need to do to perform the function of protecting us from infection. And B cells make antibodies. Now, we need T and B cells to protect us from infection, but they can go wrong. So if they start attacking our own tissues, this is called autoimmunity, and this seems to be what happens in MS. Now, my proposal is to try and understand more about inflammatory T cells. Now, what do I mean by an inflammatory T cell? So, not all T cells are the same. On a very simple level, you can think of this as that there are pro-inflammatory T cells that when they are activated will produce pro-inflammatory factors. This is going to lead to tissue injury. These are the cells that we need when we have an infection ongoing, but they can cause tissue damage in MS. We also have other types of T cells that we call regulatory T cells. These produce anti-inflammatory factors. They can switch off inflammation. They can promote wound healing and promote immune suppression. So any therapy that we've got that targets T cells entirely is going to have effects on regulatory T cells and inflammatory T cells. So we really need to understand the differences between these different types of cells to be able to come up with strategies to specifically target the players that are causing disease. Now, it's not as simple as that there's just inflammatory and regulatory T cells. I won't take you through all of these different subsets of T cells that we now talk about in the field. Needless to say, we've different subsets of these cells that make different factors, cytokines, that promote different types of immune responses. Now, it's really been a challenge to understand what types of these T cells are actually the T cells that are causing inflammation in diseases like MS. But recent attention has fallen on these cells that we call these pathogenic Th17 cells that make this cocktail of pro-inflammatory factors that really seem to be important in driving inflammation in autoimmunity and MS. All right, so why are we trying to target cell migration? So T cell entry into the brain is really likely to be a very important step in the development of MS. So in the blood vessels, T cells have to be able to get across the blood-brain barrier, which is normally quite impermeable to cells being able to cross. So we want to understand what are the actual mechanisms involved in recruiting cells from the bloodstream across the blood-brain barrier, and can we prevent this process in MS more effectively so that we're really just stopping the pro-inflammatory cells from getting into the nervous system. So cell migration is a key component of the pathogenesis of MS, and actually two of the current disease-modifying therapies that are in clinical use, fingolimod and natalizumab, are both molecules that do act to block cell migration. So fingolimod stops lymphocytes from exiting into the bloodstream from lymph nodes, and natalizumab blocks lots of different types of cells from crossing the blood-brain barrier. Now, can we come up with therapies that are actually more specific, that can actually block just those pro-inflammatory cells and not impair normal immune system function, so that we can still have good responses to infections and also not block regulatory T-cell migration? So that's really the goal. The molecules that I'm interested in are these molecules that we call chemokines. Now, these are small secreted molecules that act to attract cells. So they're produced in a response to some kind of inflammation, and cells sense where those chemokines were being produced and they move towards them. Now, it's a very, very complicated system, chemokines and chemokine receptors. There's 18 different chemokine receptors, and there's more than 50 different chemokines. So trying to untangle which receptors are involved in bringing different cell types in the immune system into different tissues is a real challenge. So what we're working on is what are the receptors that are present on these pro-inflammatory T cells in MS, and can we come up with drugs that can specifically block those very specific receptors, and not just individual receptors. We think it's combinations of these different receptors that we could target. So the question is, are there brain-specific chemokine signals that are used by inflammatory T cells to enter the nervous system in MS? So this is a diagram that was published a few years ago, trying to illustrate the complexity of targeting chemokine receptors in inflammation. So you can think of cells circulating throughout the body as being a complex system like the London Underground, and all these different chemokine receptors are the stops that are used to get off at specific places. So we want to understand what are the brain-specific signals, and not just the brain-specific signals for all cells, but for those highly inflammatory cells. So potentially we could block migration of disease-causing cells to the brain in MS without affecting a cell migration that's beneficial to the patient. We use a mouse model in our research. This is all preclinical work that we need to understand the basic mechanisms. So the model we use is called experimental autoimmune encephalomyelitis. So it closely resembles multiple sclerosis. So the mice are immunized with a fragment that comes from myelin. This activates pro-inflammatory T cells that invade the brain, and then the mice develop a paralysis that resembles the symptoms of MS in many ways. We can clinically score this over time after we immunize the mice, where they start to develop tail weakness and then tail paralysis, and then in the most severe cases they have some hind limb paralysis too. Now what we're trying to do is to come up with strategies where we can come up with a treatment that reduces these disease. So this example would be a drug that's blocking a specific chemokine receptor to try and reduce this disease. So what have we found so far? Well, we know that these pro-inflammatory Th17 cells, as we call them, we've identified 2 chemokine receptors that are very specifically expressed on those cells. That means these cells have these receptors on the surface, and that other cells in the immune system don't have this combination. And we're hoping to test by blocking both of these receptors simultaneously that we can block recruitment of these inflammatory T cells into the nervous system. We can do it individually, so we've got a CCR2 blocker, so blocking this receptor. We give that to the mice at this point where they're just developing the disease, and you can see this comes down. We've got mice that have a deletion in the gene for this receptor, so they can't make this receptor, and this is us measuring these inflammatory cells in the nervous system. Anything within these boxes is the cells that we're interested in, and you can see that when they have this gene deleted, we've significantly blocked those cells getting into the nervous system. So the next step is really to combine this, to try and see if we can block both of these different chemokine receptors simultaneously to come up with a really specific therapy that can block inflammatory T cell migration and leave normal migration of other cells intact. All right, so this was just a brief summary of everything that I've told you. So this is what we hope will happen, that we can block multiple receptors to try and understand it's almost like a key, a signature migratory signal that will get inflammatory T cells into the CNS. And hopefully we can then come up with drugs that have fewer side effects, better safety profiles, and are more effective in MS patients. But that's an ultimate goal. We're still at a very early stage at the moment. I'd just like to finish by thanking everybody in the lab. We're just in the building next door, and lots of people are contributing to this work, and I'd like to thank them all. And I'd like to thank MS Australia for the support. And I'll finish up by handing over to Dr. Julia Morahan, who's the head of research at MS Australia.
Hi everyone. Very pleased to be able to speak here today about the MS Australia research program and all of the different things that we do at both a national and international level to try and tackle what we can do to make MS a thing of the past. So this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but we really want everybody to understand the breadth of what we're doing and how we're thinking about attacking this disease. So this is where Hamish left off. As you know from his talk, we asked 3,000 people from the MS community in 2021 what they thought the priorities for MS research can be. So we can decide that as an organisation what we think is important, or we can ask the people that are actually living with the disease and their friends and families and the researchers and the clinicians what they think that we should be doing. And these were our top 3 priorities. And as Hamish said, really interestingly to me, prevention jumped from the 3rd space to the 2nd space. And I do think that is because we do have such an excellent treatment landscape in Australia now. But we are still absolutely fighting to find that cure, particularly for repair and remyelination, which I'll talk about in a minute, in order to really get able to fix the damage that has already happened in advanced MS. So we have taken those 3 priorities of our survey, as you can see there. So the find cures, develop better treatments and prevent MS through collaboration and shared infrastructure, and also support and expand clinical trials for cures and prevention of MS as the 3 pillars of our 5-year strategic plan. And we're actively funding in all of these spaces, both individual investigator-led grants like Iain Comerford's beautiful Senior Research Fellowship, but also a range of 11 different national collaborative platforms that basically bring together researchers around a particular topic so that we're avoiding duplication and accelerating outcomes in areas that we deem to be the most important. So I wanted to talk about this a little bit more because this idea of a cure is a bit of an elusive one. It's a very attractive word, but I think cure means different things to different people. And so, as Lesley-Ann said, we could have people that are being diagnosed now where we have incredibly efficacious treatments that we could put them on early and we could potentially stop their disease. I'm looking at her for confirmation. Stop their disease in its tracks and potentially hold them in a very healthy state, possibly for the rest of their lives. But then we've got other cohorts of people living with MS that don't respond to those treatments, and we've got people that are already living with significant damage. So what we really need to do as opposed to quietening down the immune system, which is what almost all of the immunotherapies that we have now do, is a way of repairing that myelin damage. So for me, the next frontier of MS research is this movement away from trying to stop the immune system from attacking the brain and the spinal cord in the first place, which we've heard about. We're getting good at that. What we can't seem to do, or we're in the early stages of doing, to be fair, is repairing the damage that has already been done, which is a completely different way of thinking about MS. So this is the future. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about our research program as well. As I mentioned, we fund research in two ways. The first way that we fund research is through investigator-led grants, which are groups of researchers that apply to us with particular projects or fellowships to look at specific ideas. We have 3 and 5 year fellowships to support people. We have scholarships for PhD students. We have projects that go for 3 years. And we also have my favourite, what we call incubator grants, which are for, I like to say, and then I get in trouble, completely ridiculous ideas in MS. So it's $25,000, 1 year of your life. You've got this idea, but you don't have any preliminary data. If you want to apply for a big grant from either us or one of the big government funding bodies, you can't turn up without preliminary data, but there's no way to get that preliminary data. So we were the first organisation in Australia to start this. Other people have picked it up now. Give them a little bit of money and a short amount of time just to see if it's a good idea. And it turns out that that is one of the most amazing things that we've ever done. We have so for every $1 that we put in our research program overall, those researchers are able to, on average, go and get $5 from other funding bodies to continue that work. We're pretty good at picking the winners. For the incubator grants, for the $25,000 people, for every $1 we give them, they're able to get $27 for their future work. So it's just a really nice way of seeding new ideas and making sure that we're capturing all the silly things that might be going on that could be really interesting in MS. So this is our snapshot document. It lists all of the investigator-led grants that we fund at any given time. At the moment, we're funding 111 grants across the entire country and across the strategy. So you can see we've divided them up in that document, but across the cure, the better treatments, the prevention, plus across all the different fields. So we have things happening basically across every way that you could possibly think about MS, and that's part of our strategy, but also everywhere around the country. So we're very proud of that part of our funding. The second way that we fund research is through a more targeted approach. All that we ask of our investigator-led applicants is that they are focusing on MS and that they can show us that it's an innovative and good idea, it's merit-based, and that it has relevance to people with MS and the community. There are other bigger questions that we can answer in a different way, and we call those national collaborative research platforms. So at the moment we're running 8 of those, and the idea behind the national collaborative research platforms, which is also something that MS Australia does that other not-for-profits very rarely do, is bring people, researchers, people with MS, together around particular topics that we think are of incredible importance in MS. So I'm not going to talk about all of these in detail, but I just wanted to mention them because they are, in fact, incredibly important resources for our Australian and international MS community. So Anne's Gene is our genetics platform. Genetics is a numbers game, and they have 3,000 DNA samples from people with MS around the country. They're one of the most successful publishing genetic groups in the world and have discovered a whole range of genetic risk factors for the development of MS. We now know that over 200 genes are associated with the risk of MS with the Anne's Gene as well as the international collaboration. We have the MS Australia Brain Bank, which collects brain tissue from people living with MS and people not living with MS after their death, because mice are very important, Iain, but they're not people. So we need to look at the brains, the actual brains that are affected by MS, to see what's going on with all those cells that Iain was talking about. We need to look at the actual tissue of the people. So we have set up that brain bank. It's actually a very substantial collection, and we provide that tissue for research internationally. It's incredibly well respected. We have the Australian MS longitudinal study, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more, and Lesley-Ann also mentioned. We have the Informs project, which I'm going to talk about as well, the MS Clinical Trials website, and also a registry looking at AHSCT, which is the autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplant treatment for MS, which is really now becoming the part of the arsenal for treating people with MS. The registry's now been going for some time, and it allows us to track the outcomes of everybody who has been undertaken this treatment for MS in Australia, and track their outcomes to essentially make sure that if we're offering it to people, that we're offering it to the right person where we're most likely of success. And then also Prevans, which is a very long-running and very exciting clinical trial that we funded, which I will talk about in more detail, that just read out at the most recent ECTRIMS conference, which is the largest conference in MS in the world. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that. So here we go straight into Prevans. So Prevans, essentially the idea was, so this was the first meeting I went to when I joined the organisation 10 years ago. There was all of this circumstantial evidence around whether or not vitamin D might be a thing for MS. So we have the latitude gradient. We know people that are deficient in MS are more likely to have a risk of developing MS. We know that there is low vitamin D associated with seasonal relapses. Nobody knew whether or not actually giving people with MS or people at risk of developing MS was going to stop them or delay their development of MS. This was a trial that needed to be done. No one in industry was interested because, of course, you can just go to the pharmacy and buy a bottle of vitamin D, so no one would do it. So we did it. It's the most expensive thing we've ever done. It took us an incredibly long time. It was supposed to be a 4-year study. It went for 8, but we got there in the end. And essentially what we did was look at 202 people. We stratified them across 3 different doses of vitamin D, and we also compared them to a placebo arm. And the people were what we call clinically isolated syndrome people. So so to have I'm telling you, but to have a diagnosis of MS, you need to have 2 attacks separated in time and space. So the people that were included in this trial had only had 1 attack. So they did not yet have MS, but they were very high risk of developing MS. So we hit them with vitamin D for 48 weeks and then tracked them to see whether or not we could delay their development of MS. So we announced the results last month at the conference, and as Lesley-Ann said, they were negative. So this is really interesting now because we know that there is definitely a UV radiation situation going on. There's definitely a gradient, but it is probably not simply the vitamin D that is mediating that protection. So there is something else going on with the UV that might be able to prevent these people. It also doesn't tell us whether people that were at risk but have absolutely not even started on their MS journey, so no attacks at all, would benefit from having vitamin D. And we also ran this study in Australia where we're pretty good at getting vitamin D. So we really still need to answer a lot of questions about what would happen if we supplemented people that were truly deficient of vitamin D. And as Lesley-Ann said, if I were deficient and I had MS or I had a family member with MS, I absolutely would be still making sure that I had sufficient levels of vitamin D, but swallowing an entire bottle of vitamin D capsules every morning is probably not going to help you. That doesn't mean the UV has changed, but incredibly important. And then also tied in with another study from Ellen Mowry that showed that vitamin D as an add-on to DMF was not helpful above and beyond what that medication would have done. So this story is changing. It's probably not just vitamin D, but there is still a lot we need to know about sunshine and its effects on the immune system. So this is good. I know it's weird to say that negative results are good, but I'm a scientist, so the nightmare for me was we get to the end of this and we say, I don't know. This is definitively negative. We know this is not a thing now, so we can move on. Even the negative pieces of the puzzle are incredibly important. The Australian longitudinal study, Lesley-Ann also mentioned, so this is our longest ever running national platform since 2002, and essentially it's what we now call patient-reported outcome research. This is incredibly fashionable now. We've been doing it for ages. The idea is you ask people with MS about their life, about their MS. We ask them once a year how they're going with their MS, what their symptoms are, what their quality of life is. And then we also throw in a number of other surveys around specific things that researchers have come to us to say they want to ask, or things that we want to do. So things like pain, how are you going with pain? How are you going with sleep? How are you going with your employment? Which medications do you use? And we've also used it to build our economic impact report based on the cost of illness. We also used this to build our MS nurses report that was also launched at our conference in April this year, which is the first evidence-based report to show that MS nurses are pivotal. I think we all knew that, but to show that they were pivotal and that they make such a difference to people's care, which then means that when we go to advocate to government and others about making this service available to people, we've got the data. And it just is such an important piece of work that we've done, and we're now ramping up the advocacy around that to make sure that we can try and increase the access to MS nurses for everybody living with MS in Australia. And I should say that we have about 3,000 people with MS, but the reason that this study is so powerful is we know that those 3,000 people are reflective of the Australian MS population as a whole. So the difference between this study and other cohort studies where people are asked questions means that you can only say, well, that it's true for those 3,000 people. We have shown that these 3,000 people are reflective of Australians with MS. So then when we go to government, we can say, this is what is happening to the population as a whole. So it's a fantastic resource. We are always recruiting. Thank you, Lesley-Ann, for doing my job and bringing the pamphlets. Also jump on our website. I'll put the websites up at the end. Please consider being involved. It can be on paper, it can be online, but we just need as many people telling us about their MS as possible so that we can use those stories to convince others to do things about advocacy issues. And one of the last thing that I wanted to talk about is our international work. So we're extremely fortunate to actually be one of the top MS research funders of MS in the world, and we work with other countries that are very interested in MS research in the same sort of platform way, where we're trying to reduce duplication and make sure that everybody's collaborating and we're all kind of know what everybody is doing. We do that primarily in two ways. The first one is the International Progressive MS Alliance. So this started a number of years ago, and it was essentially to recognise as a global research community that yes, we're doing quite well for relapsing forms of MS. We've got 15 or 16 medications. We can get people kind of stopped. If we can stop the active disease, that's great. What are we doing about progressive MS? What do we know about progressive MS? What do we know about progression? And how are we going to speed up the treatments for those people with progressive forms of disease? And we decided the best way to do that was to come together as a global community and try and make that happen. So we put money into the International Progressive MS Alliance, as do many others, and we're a managing member, and we fund global research around the world. So we fund little grants, including Australians doing ideas around progression, which are fantastic, but we also fund big international collaborations looking at very important network questions around MS. And we've got an industry forum that allows us to bring in the pharmaceutical companies and all of the results, negative or positive, from all of the clinical trials that have happened in progressive MS ever. And we're really trying to nut this out at a global level and close the gap between the difference of what you can be offered if you are a person with relapsing forms of MS versus somebody with progressive forms of MS. The other group that we work with quite strongly is called the MS International Federation, and this is a group of all of the MS organisations around the world that do either patient services like MS South Australia, Northern Territory, as well as fund research like MS Australia. We do a whole range of things with them, including the MS Atlas, which maps MS around the world. We do a project on patient-reported outcomes, so how do people in Greece feel about their MS compared to people in Australia, compared to people in France, compared to people in Egypt. We do consensus statements, so as a global community, how do we feel about vitamin D? How do we feel about smoking? What can we do about all of these different ideas? We're just starting a new one looking at EBV, Epstein-Barr virus, the one that causes glandular fever. That's a very strong risk factor for MS, and about what the research needs to move to for that. And also, what are we going to do with the remyelination phase? So it's just a really great group of people where we're thinking all together, so that it's not just a pocket of Australians thinking about something and a pocket of Spanish people. We're all together thinking about the same sorts of things and how we can do it best and how we can speed it up. So I promised you our websites. So we have a few. The top one is the MS Australia general website, which includes descriptions of everything that we fund and much more about all of the national platforms that we do, as well as all of our advocacy work. The MS Australia Brain Bank has its own website, so if that's something that you're interested in, please log on to that website and fill in an expression of interest, and we will talk to you about that. The MS Clinical Trials website, actually Lesley-Ann did for me, thank you, is the one that has the list of all clinical trials or studies recruiting for participants happening in MS in Australia and New Zealand at any given time, and we update it constantly, so you can log on, say what type of MS you have, say the type of trial you have, say you live in Adelaide, and it will give you a list of things that you might want to be interested in. So just trying to close that gap between people wanting to be involved in research but not really knowing where to start. And then we also have the websites associated with all of the international work, which is incredibly exciting, and the Progressive MS Alliance, they've just announced another tranche of funding to say all of the things that we're planning to get kick-started for next year, and all the different things, including the MS Atlas that the MS International Federation does. I think that's it. So anyway, so thank you very much for your attention. All right, so I would now like to welcome Jess Worsley. Jess is a member of the MS Society South Australia and Northern Territory's People Living with MS Advisory Group. Jess lives with MS and would just like to say a few words. So thank you, Jess.
As a person living with MS, it's a real privilege to be present here today. I am living a rich and fulfilling life while living with MS, and that is thanks to the medical research that continues to grow and expand our knowledge and understanding of the disease, its impact on our lives, and allow for the development of new and improved treatment options to slow and prevent our disease progression. I would love to thank all our guests, including both in person and virtually. Thank you to each of our guest speakers and experts in the field for sharing your knowledge, insight and experiences with us. Spreading awareness and understanding is so important in establishing not only a safe and inclusive society, but the continued generous funding that allows this life-changing research to continue, to improve our lives and move us closer towards that big dream of a cure. Thank you for your continued kindness and generosity as we all continue to fight this disease together and continue supporting the MS community and MS researchers like those we heard from today. Thank you for walking this very bumpy road with us. It means more than words could describe.
Thank you for those words, Jess. We've now come to the exciting part of the proceedings when I get to grill our panel of experts with the questions that you have provided me. So if I could ask the three experts to come and take a seat. Excellent. We've received some absolutely excellent questions. Some of them are quite challenging. Unfortunately, we can't answer questions of a personal nature, nor can we give advice about medications. For those, we would urge you to contact your healthcare professional. And just looking at the time, we probably won't be able to answer all the questions that have been submitted, but we'll try and get as many of the questions answered as possible. But also, you can always send us some questions. We always love to hear from people living with MS, and we're always happy to answer them. I'm going to pass the microphone over to the panel. Hopefully that's better. Right. So, first up. So, for the panel, just feel free to jump in if you have an answer. If there's a specific question, I might direct it to one person. The first question is, MS is an inflammatory autoimmune disease. There's currently a lot of research being undertaken on the relationship of the gut, skin, and chest microbiome with other inflammatory autoimmune conditions such as asthma and eczema. May the connection also apply in respects of MS?
Yes. So, there is a great deal of interest at the moment between what people are now calling the gut-brain health axis, and there is quite a lot of work going on in whether or not that kind of microbiome profile might be different between people with MS and people that don't have MS, as it is happening in other diseases. I will say that research is incredibly difficult and also incredibly difficult to interpret. So it is absolutely something that we're very interested in, but it's going to be, I think, quite a while before we understand what that will mean for people with MS and whether or not there's something that we can do in order to turn that research into an intervention. But yes.
Excellent, thank you. Now, there's been a number of questions that have been talking about remyelination, so I'll try and lump it all together. We've heard a lot about it this afternoon already, but is the mechanism of demyelination of nerve cells deemed a cure, and how far has research come to making this a reality for people with MS?
That was like 6 questions. Thanks, Hamish. So yes. So I said before, a cure is a contentious word. So remyelination is potentially one way that we might be able to cure people with MS. Prevention of MS in the first place is another way that we might be able to cure people with MS where it just doesn't happen in the first place. Remyelination as a cure will still require lifelong management. Remyelination as a research topic is something that's still kind of at the fundamental stages, but it is something that is moving into clinical trials, and it's something that we're super excited about. So as I said, the International Progressive MS Alliance, and as Lesley-Ann said, there are a number of clinical trials that are happening at the moment. We've had clinical trials, they've been negative, but we're learning more and more all the time. And I think people are really moving from that idea of trying to sort out the immune system and into this idea about what we can do about the demyelination and the damage. So it is in what I would term the preclinical stages. Some of them have moved into the clinical stage, but we're going to keep going. And we've got so many different ideas and so many things coming down the pipeline because we're just understanding more and more about how we can possibly do the repair. So it's there, but it's in the future.
Excellent, thank you.
Can-
Now,
can-
the next... Oh, sorry.
Can I just add to
Yep.
that as well? I mean, I think the important thing is recognizing too that we really have only just started looking. We, 30, 40 years ago, we had only just started looking for a way to reduce the risk of relapses. And with the amount of technology that we have available and the collaborative capacity that we have to be able to speak to our colleagues in the UK, for instance, at the drop of a hat, I think that if you use the example of relapsing disease and how far we came within 30 to 40 years, when you had a lot of people putting their minds together and putting their efforts down on paper, sort of thing, hopefully it won't take as long. I would have my fingers crossed. So, but we are still in the preliminary stages of being able to understand how we can achieve that.
Excellent. Lesley-Ann, you might want to keep hold of the microphone. The next one, it's not about a cure, but what research do we have in progress that would allow accurate forecasts to be given to people with MS on their disease progression, and how far off is this to be put into practice? The person's added, the worst thing for me is not knowing, I'd rather know.
It's a good question, and it's actually a very difficult one. And that's often one of the things that people will ask when they are first diagnosed and they're sitting in your clinic room. And I think the part of the issue is we still see this legacy of what happened 30, 40 years ago. Unfortunately, when you say MS, the first thing most people think of is their next door neighbor down the road who was diagnosed 40 years ago, who was in a wheelchair by the time they were 40 years old. And that is what MS is to them. And I think that's why it's really important to say, look, okay, yes, everyone is very different. We can't tell right from the very beginning a lot of the times whether someone has really aggressive disease or whether it's going to be something that's very easily managed with a moderate efficacy treatment, for instance. We just don't know. And that's part of the reason why we are constantly following up on people, monitoring their responses to various therapies. And often what we find is time is actually the best predictor in terms of what their outcomes may be. But if there is one thing that is consistent that I do try and say to people is that being on some kind of a treatment to minimize the risk of new relapses, if you have relapsing forms of the disease, is better than being on nothing. And it doesn't really matter which one it is. You could have the old school kind of injectable therapies, you could have the really high efficacy infusion therapies. They are all going to provide you with a benefit, and we know in the long term they have impacts on what that long-term outcome is looking like. And I guess the only other thing I would really strongly recommend to people too is when they're looking at someone else with MS, just remember their MS is very different to yours. It's really important not to compare yourself to anybody else because, as we said before, what works well for one person doesn't work well for another, and we shouldn't be comparing ourselves to other people because that your journey with MS is very much your own, and we are here to support you through it. And as we were saying before, I mean, our recommendations and our advice to you is based on research and evidence-based data that comes out of research. And it's constantly changing. So I'm going to have to swallow my tongue about vitamin D, I think, for a bit.
No, I don't think so. I think we've got lots more questions to answer. I just wanted to add as well about the there was a piece in there about prognosis. So what people say in the clinic, I imagine, is I need you to tell me what I'm going to look like, or can you tell me what I'm going to look like in 7 years, 10 years, 15 years' time? And for me as a ex-researcher or as a researcher, that is where the registry data is really coming into its own now. So Lesley-Ann mentioned MS Base, which is the biggest tracker of clinical outcomes and medications across the world. Australia is headquartered here, and Australian neurologists and people living with MS in Australia are very much included in that. But they are using that data, which is now, decades old, to try and build algorithms to see whether or not they can try and give people a bit of an idea. It's a whole field, right? It's incredibly interesting, and again, we're not at a stage where we would be able to tell you, but the big data sets are the ones that are going to be able to tell us, because the variability between people means we need hundreds of thousands of people to see whether or not we can figure that out. And that is an absolute active area of research, very much also in Australia, and I think it's fascinating, and we're all waiting to see if we can kind of use that in clinical practice soon.
Excellent. And now there's just been a couple of questions asked about the genetics of MS. One of them is, I have MS and offspring with MS. What's the likelihood of their children developing MS? And there's a very similar question asking if when one person, i.e. the mother, has MS, what are the risks of the sibling who has a brother and a mother with MS?
Okay, excellent question, and also one that I imagine comes up in the clinic very often. So you can correct me if I get my numbers wrong. But so we know that genetics is part of the risk of MS. So I mentioned we now have over 200 changes in genes that could potentially alter somebody's risk of developing MS. It is not the only way, or it's not the only risk factor of developing MS. Hamish talked about some of the environmental risk factors, Epstein-Barr virus that causes glandular fever, the vitamin D UV story, where you live, lots of other different pieces. I like to think of it as a threshold. So smoking is another one. Think of it as a threshold. So if you've got a little bit of genetics that is not great, but then you add smoking and then you add low vitamin D, then maybe you're going to tip yourself over a threshold and potentially develop MS. But those modifiable risk factors, you can't change your genetics, but those modifiable risk factors like smoking, you can change. And that could make the difference. In terms of family, relatives of people that are living with MS, so if you have a parent with MS, your risk of MS is potentially 1 in 100 from a genetic perspective, but that's not the whole story. There's still all of those other risk factors that you can have. If you have a mother with MS, I think one of the questions, mother with MS and a brother with MS, the brother with MS isn't going to increase your risk of MS because your genes just come from your mum and your dad. So if your mum has MS, you probably still have that 1 in 100 chance. But you do have all of these other modifiable lifestyle factors that you can use to modify your risk of MS throughout your lifetime. So genetics is not the whole story by any means, but it is part of the story.
Excellent, thank you. Unfortunately, that's probably all we have time for today. Iain, you're let off the hook. There's a few immunological questions that maybe we'll be able to answer by email for the people that have asked them. This brings our event to conclusion. Thank you all for attending, and thank you for your support of the MS Society of South Australia and Northern Territory and for MS Australia. If you're able, I'd like to ask you to be upstanding for Her Excellency and Mr. Bunton's departure. Excellent, you can be seated. And once again, this brings us to the end of the proceedings this afternoon, and I'd like to thank you for your attendance, and those online, I'd like to thank you for your attendance as well. And I think we probably might have a few minutes at the end of the session if you want to ask the experts a question, but that's the end of the formal proceedings. Thank you.